Accidental Marriage by Shadina. Chapter 5. Why was it that Edward couldn't win a damn thing in his damn life? He had been joking! He had no interest in going on a honeymoon with Roy, not at all, and this was what the dark-haired man was telling him. They were going to Long Beach for their honeymoon, leaving tomorrow. Was he nuts? Seriously, Roy needed his head checked out. Edward stood at the bottom of the stairs, his arms crossed over his chest tightly, and his golden eyes narrowed dangerously up at the Colonel. "I'm not going," he said firmly. He wasn't going on any stupid honeymoon. That's what married people did. You know, people that love each other. Roy and him were not like that. They were married against their will, so there was no reason why they should pretend to be in love. "You don't have a choice. I'm the Colonel." Roy glared at the irritating blonde. "This is personal matters. You can't pull rank here." Ed snapped back. "I can think of better ways to put that money to use, such as getting Al and I a place away from you." Roy snorted. "This is a present from a general, Full Metal, my commanding officer when I first joined the military. He gave us this money for a honeymoon, not to spend it on an apartment. Now, do you really want to offend General Hall, who was being so gracious to us?" Ed's grip on his arms visibly tightened. Ed didn't have anything against the general. In fact, he seemed like a very nice man, especially giving them such a huge sum of money to have a getaway. If this was given to a couple that was actually in love, it would be a wonderful present indeed, but Ed and Roy were not in love, nor was Ed too eager to spend time with his forced spouse. "Why don't you just tell them what really happened?" he said through gritted teeth. "Why don't you?" Roy replied back smartly. Ed scowled. Damn it, Roy had him. He didn't want to hurt the cheerful general, and though he acted like he didn't care about other people's feelings, he actually did, especially those that showed so much kindness, a rarity in Ed's book. He muttered under his breath. Roy cocked an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, Full Metal, what was that?" "I said, fine, I'm going," he said, irritated. "Only if Al's coming." Roy made a frustrated noise. "Full Metal, your brother can't come. It's a honeymoon. You don't bring other people with you on a honeymoon." He couldn't believe this kid. Besides, he bent down so their noses were almost touching. "Didn't you want to know what all this marriage life entails?" The youth turned red and quickly turned so that Roy was hit with his blonde braid. "I'm going to pack," he said as he hurried to go find his room again, leaving Roy to snicker in the hallway. That had been too much fun, he decided, before heading off to pack himself. The next morning had been a fury of tempers and movement. Ed had still been packed from his move from the dorm to Roy's mansion, but he had found alchemy books and had to find places to stuff them. Al had shown him around the library when he had found him, and the two of them stayed there nearly the entire night. The collection was very impressive. Many books he'd never seen before, and were certainly not in Central's library. He was so excited when he saw those really old ones, but didn't take any of those. Those books needed to be taken care of properly, and more than likely would not survive the train trip south. But he had an entire year in this house, or at least until he finished paying off those buildings, to read them so he'd get the chance. However, right now, Edward was tired and cranky. They had to be at the station at 5. It was already 4:30, and Roy was trying to shove him out the door. "I can walk out the door myself, Mustang," he growled, resisting Roy's shoving. "Then do so, and stop taking your sweet time. We'll miss the train, and if we miss the train, we'll miss the other 2 trains, and it'll be 3 days before the next train comes back." The first train they were taking was going to be the longest ride out of the 3 they'd have to catch. It'd be a day and a half. The other 2 were only 3 hours each, which meant they were going to be stuck in a cramped train box together for 2 days. Not fun. Edward grunted and picked up his suitcase again, now that Roy was no longer pushing him. Sometimes it was nice to have an automill arm. There would be no way he'd be able to carry this suitcase if he just had 2 flesh arms. He doesn't have a lot of clothes, but if you remember, he was having a hard time finding space for his books. He lifted the suitcase with one arm, but because of his height, he was finding it rather awkward to carry it, thus having to set it down several times to find a different position, so they hadn't even got out the door yet. Al looked between the 2 tempers and moved closer to the one he was more familiar with. "Nissan, how about I carry that? You can't miss your train." Edward glared at Al. "Who are you saying is too tiny that he can't carry his own luggage lest he drowns in the snow?" he yelled. Al looked nervously at the Colonel and could see his temper starting to spike as well. He had to be quick. Nissan, I didn't say that at all. I'm just saying it'll be quicker if we put it inside me so we don't have to worry about it. The cab's waiting on us, and you don't want to walk to the station, do you?
Edward muttered but gave his baggage to his brother. Al offered the same to Roy, who accepted, if only to get out of there. They headed out into the snow, Roy in the lead, and Ed and Al walking together behind him. Ed was constantly muttering something horrible about the Colonel, but Al didn't think Roy could hear him over the crunching of their footsteps, so he let his brother rant. Better to do it now than when the two of them were in an enclosed space with no way out. They went through the wrought iron gate, and Roy handed Al the keys since Al would be staying there. They walked a block before seeing the taxi. So they wouldn't freak out the driver, Roy and Ed took out their suitcases and finished their journey with them in hand. Well, Roy had his in hand. Al ended up confiscating Ed since he was doing the same thing he had down in the house. Roy was beginning to wonder what the hell Edward packed. Maybe he was more like a girl than he originally thought. The cab driver got out of the obviously warm car and shuffled through the snow to get the luggage. He wore a homemade black and white winter hat that his mousy brown hair stuck out from the bottom and tickled his neck and jaw. His small dark eyes peeked out from under thick brown eyebrows, and his top lip was covered by just as thick of a mustache. His jacket made him appear to have a rather bulky frame, and his mittens seemed worn with use. With practiced ease, he took Ed's and Roy's suitcase and strapped them down on the back. Ed turned to Al, and they shared a farewell. Rarely had they ever been separated, but now here they were being separated. Of course, the two of them were trying to act like it was no big deal. Al waved at Roy, and Roy nodded his head before slipping into the taxi, followed by Ed. The driver started the car up, and Ed turned to watch Al miserably as he disappeared. "It's only for 2 weeks, Full Metal."
Roy was staring ahead. Ed turned around and slouched in his seat with a grunt. 2 weeks without his baby brother. Instead, he got a bastard. Something told him he was jibed when it came to the equivalent exchange. It wasn't long before the cab driver pulled up to the station and quickly got out. Opening the door for Ed and Roy, he stood there closing it when they got out. Roy told Ed to get the bags while he went to collect the tickets that he had reserved. The train wasn't there yet. Apparently, it was running a bit behind schedule. This was just as well for Roy. That meant they wouldn't have to run to catch it. He doubted they could with how heavy Ed's bag was. He stuffed the tickets into his inner coat pocket and moved to stand beside Ed. The cab driver had been nice enough to help Ed bring them to the dock. He paid the man, making sure to tip generously. The man quickly left without saying anything, and the two men were left alone to wait for the train. Ed sneezed and wondered if someone was talking about him. They didn't have to wait long for the steel snake to park near the dock. A flood of people exited the train once the doors were opened. This was Central, after all. There was bound to be a lot of traffic. Roy and Ed shoved their way through the masses and managed to get on the train. Roy had gotten them their own cabin in the train, so they wouldn't have to worry about cramped corridors. Roy slid the door open with one hand and finished opening it with his boot. He put his luggage in the compartment overhead before settling on the bench. Ed was willing to try to get his suitcase up there, so he left it on the ground and flopped back onto the opposite bench in a laying position. "I'm going to sleep, so don't bother me," Ed warned the dark-haired man, who snorted in response and proceeded to stare out the window. Roy ended up falling asleep out of sheer boredom. With Ed asleep, there wasn't really much to entertain himself with. He had read a book and worked on some theories in his journal, but now he was just flat out bored. Well, actually, now he was just asleep. But it was a light sleep, more of a nap than anything else. So he woke up after Ed kept coughing. He sighed and turned his attention to the little blonde sleeping, and noticed his face looked a bit flushed. His brows furrowed, and he reached out to touch the teen's forehead and found that he was running a fever. Roy sighed and wondered if this was some sort of bad omen or something. Doing what any responsible adult would, he anticipated Ed's needs and spoke to one of the ladies working on the train, requesting some aspirin and water for his sick companion. He also asked for a cool cloth, or at least some ice and a cloth, something to help bring the fever down. Roy knew Edward well enough to not expect any gratitude whatsoever, but he did it nonetheless. He had always taken care of the boy, and there wasn't any reason to stop now. He thanked the lady when she gave him everything that he had requested. He was surprised that Ed slept through the entire exchange. He let the cloth get cold from the ice before putting it on his forehead, then moved to go back to his theories. Ed would wake up when he woke up, then Roy would give him the aspirin and water. Until then, he could just sleep. The young alchemist groaned softly as he woke up, feeling as though his head had been run over by the few dozen trains. No, that would feel better than this, because by that time he wouldn't be feeling anything at all.
Speaking of trains, he was on one right now, wasn't he? To where? Oh yeah, Long Beach for his and Roy's honeymoon. That brought out another strangled groan. I must admit, you make a great impression of a strangled cat. Edward cranked his golden eyes open and turned his head to where that smirking voice came from. Yes, a smirking voice. He didn't know how the Colonel did it, but Ed could just hear the smirk in his voice. He opened his mouth to say something, but found a sudden chalky substance in his mouth. He made a face and went to spit it out, but the bastard wouldn't let him, instead lifted a glass to his lips, and Ed drank it, if only to get rid of the chalky gunk. Oh God, what if Roy just drugged him with something? What if this really was the plot to get back at him for all those times he caused Roy more paperwork or did something that was classified as insubordination? What if it was Roy's fault that he was feeling this bad right now? Had he been drugged already while he slept? How long was Mustang planning on keeping him like this? Would his death be quick or slow and painful? What the hell did you give me, you bastard? Ed croaked out. Roy looked at him amused. He'd been right. Ed was obviously not a very gracious person. Aspirin to bring your fever down, he told him. Edward gave him a suspicious look, Roy noticed, and raised an eyebrow, not sure what it was that Edward was thinking. Aspirin, right, a great cover-up. How did the bastard know he was running this fever in the first place? Ed himself had just found it. It had to be drug-induced, that sly bastard. He went to sit up on his body protest, emanating another groan. Damn, now he couldn't move either. He glared at the dark-haired man completely at his mercy. Now, what a scary thing. Roy took the cloth and put it on his forehead again. Ed couldn't help but admit that it felt good. Go back to sleep, Edward. We still have a long way to go, he told him. It didn't even click in Ed's head that he had called him Edward instead of Full Metal. If it had, he would have known that he was going to hell in a handbasket. Not that he could fit in a handbasket. He wasn't that short, damn it! It wasn't until the next day that Edward woke up again. He still felt like crap, but he was hungry. He managed to sit up and found that Roy was awake as well, sipping at some coffee. Coffee. You could use some of that. Roy's eyes flickered from the window to the sickly blonde. You're awake. He pointed out the obvious. He pulled the string near the window, the one that alerts the attendant that they need something. A lady with wavy light brown hair that rested heavily on her shoulders came in with a bowl of something hot and some toast with jam and a glass of orange juice. She greeted them and set the tray down on a small table she brought with her in front of Edward. Apparently the hot stuff was hot cereal, and unfortunately the orange juice wasn't cold either. The lady left quickly after Roy thanked her, to hide her blush. He smirked seeing it and turned his attention to his sick spouse, who was making the most amusing faces as he stared at what was in front of him. What the hell is this crap? Ed demanded. Hot cereal, it's good for you, especially when you're sick. Now eat up, Roy said, then took another sip of his coffee. I'm not eating this, he said stubbornly. Well, that's what I ordered you, so eat. Edward kept making faces as he went to take a bite, causing Roy to roll his eyes. Do you want me to spoon-feed you? He asked. Ed shot him a glare and huffed before choking it down. After Edward was done with the food, but not done with the faces, Roy offered him 2 more aspirins. Here. Ed stopped to look at them suspiciously. What are those? He asked, his blonde eyes flickering from the pills to Roy's face. Aspirin, he said with a roll of his eyes. The boy was acting like he was trying to kill him or something. After a moment, Roy got impatient and stuffed the pills in his hands. You could take them and feel better or not. That's your choice, he said, and went back to what he was reading. Ed studied them a moment longer, trying to decide if they were really aspirin or not. He decided to go ahead and take them. Of course, that meant drinking the warm orange juice, which brought on a new set of faces. The rest of the train rides were not very eventful, probably because Ed was passed out most of the time. Roy kind of envied him. He wished he could sleep more on a train, but he couldn't. Roy anticipated and saw to Ed's needs, while Ed watched suspiciously, trying to figure out what in the world Roy was doing. Roy woke Ed up when it was time to get ready to get off the train. They had made it to their destination. Ed woke up groggily. Honestly, he was feeling better, just tired mostly. He sat up and saw Roy's butt was in his face and turned his head, blushing for some unknown reason. The colonel got his luggage down on the floor. The train came to a stop sooner than he had anticipated, causing him to fall back onto Edward. They both grunted in surprise. Unfortunately, Roy had to wait until the damn train had finished stopping before he could get up off of Ed's lap without falling back onto him. Ed could feel Roy pushing back against him as the train was coming to a stop. Rather than being furious about Roy mistaking him for a seat, he found his mind wandering to other things, such as Roy's clothes made him look bigger than what he was, apparently. He was surprisingly rather thin. That and his ass was rather firm. Okay, now Ed was just disturbed. Why did he even care how thin or firm Roy's ass was? The train finished its long stop, and Roy got up quickly. He was feeling a little embarrassed for falling on Ed like that. He covered it up, though, by teasing Ed. "Ah, I'm sorry, Full Metal. I didn't realize you were there." He offered the slightly embarrassed-looking boy a smirk. Edward latched quickly on the lifeline. "Who are you calling so tiny you can't find him among the fibers of a cushioned bench?" he snapped. "Why, I believe evidence points to you," he said. Ed looked ready to blow again, but started coughing suddenly. Roy frowned. "Come on, let's get you to the hotel," he said, picking up Ed's suitcase, leaving his lighter one for Ed to carry since he needed both hands to lug this one off the train. Ed blinked when he saw Roy carrying his suitcase. "I can carry my own," he growled, moving to take it back. Roy moved it out of his reach. "I'm well aware that you can. However, you're not feeling all that well, and it's best not to exert yourself right now. Just grab mine so we can get off the train before it leaves the station." Ed nodded his head stunned before he grabbed Roy's bag. His little brother had always said the colonel looked after them, but never did he actually see what he was talking about, or maybe he just didn't want to see. He frowned. He didn't like this realization. It made it harder to hate the bastard. He got off the train, his lips pressed together, and his brows furrowed deep in thought. Roy cleared his throat, causing Ed to look up. He soon found his hands empty, the suitcase taken by a bulky, balding, brown-haired man. Ed found his nose rather amusing, as it hooked and nearly took up his whole face. He ideally wondered if he had a really good sense of smell. He went to turn his attention back to Roy, but the man was missing. Looking around, he found the black-haired man getting in the cab, so Ed followed. He was rather surprised he could see him, it being dark already. To Edward, the cab drive was uncomfortable. With his sudden revelation, he wasn't exactly sure how to act around the man that had always taken care of his brother and him. It kinda irked him. Why the hell did that bastard think he couldn't take care of himself? He'd been doing it for years. He suddenly frowned. In reality, he hadn't been doing it for years. There was always someone to help take care of them. Their mom, teacher, Auntie Pinaco, then Colonel Bastard. All of them had taken care of him and his brother. He was grateful to the first three, but Colonel Bastard, he didn't know how he felt about that. He knew he should feel grateful, but it just irritated him. Of course, the bastard irritated him, so that was probably why. But why would the man take care of him if all they ever did was fight? It didn't make any sense. Maybe you should ask him. He peeked at Roy from the corner of his eyes. The man was staring straight ahead. He snorted mentally. "Yeah, I'll ask him when I start preaching about there being a god." He seemed to find this thought rather funny and snickered to himself. This caught Roy's attention, and he gave him a funny look, but only got a smirk from the blonde in response. They arrived at the hotel. It was huge, bigger than Roy's mansion. He couldn't see much of the outside, though. It was just too dark, but there were a lot of stairs. What was with people and stairs? Ed was really starting to hate stairs. A bellhop dressed in green and gold came down the stairs quickly to get their luggage. Ed just followed Roy. He seemed to know what he was doing. Like at the courthouse, Ed hung back while Roy spoke to the receptionist. It seemed like the lady was constantly giggling, and it irritated Ed. Honestly, did she need to do it that much? Roy wasn't even funny. Roy came back with a smirk and handed the blonde a key. "This is to our room," he said. Ed rolled his eyes. Well, duh. What else would it be to? He followed Roy up several flights of stairs. Why hadn't Roy gotten a room on the first floor? Roy didn't mind the stairs. After all, he grew up in that mansion, and his room there was on the 3rd level. He just didn't mind walking up and down them. Except maybe when he was sick. Really sick. Then yes, they could be irritating, but not enough to change anything. Besides, him getting sick was rarity. Roy got to the room and opened the door and walked in, stopping to take off his shoes. The room was really nice. The color scheme was red and silver. There was a huge bed to the left that had tall silver rods that twisted up on each corner of the bed. There were tons of different pillows, and the bed itself looked incredibly fluffy. On each side of were the doors, one that led to a walk-in closet and the other to the bathroom. Along the wall to the right of the bed was a long dresser with a mirror. To the left of them was a sitting area with a couch, an overstuffed chair, and a glass coffee table with coasters. The couch was facing the fireplace that was currently lit. The fireplace was made of stone and had a large abstract painting above it. Across from the fireplace, there were these long drapes, like something you'd find in a theater, along the wall. Behind these drapes was a long window that looked out to the ocean and private beach. It was really nice. The bellhop moved past them and set their suitcases on the floor and started to put their stuff away quickly. They really didn't have a lot, so he was gone shortly. Ed was quick to claim the bed, jumping on it. "I get the bed," he announced. Roy frowned because that left Roy with the couch. He was sure that Ed would be more comfortable on the couch than he would, considering he was smaller, but at the moment he didn't really feel up to arguing with the chibi. "At least give me a blanket and a pillow," he said, holding his hand out expectantly. Ed threw them at Roy, the blanket covering half his head and the pillow covering the other half. It made Ed snigger at the sight. Roy just rolled his eyes and moved to set his bed up on the couch. Edward was rather giddy, never having been in a place so nice, well, other than Roy's. He was bouncing a bit as he went to take everything in. Roy looked over at him and shook his head. "You're supposed to be sick, not on a sugar high," he said, causing Ed to frown. "Go to sleep. Everything will be just the same when you wake up." Edward made a face. "I know that, bastard," he said, but did as he was told and crawled under the blankets. This was so much more comfortable than the train bench. Roy hunkered down on the couch, which wasn't bad, but his feet hung off, so he had to curl up a bit to sleep comfortably. He yawned, having not slept a lot on the train, and watched the flame in the fireplace dance. The blanket was thick and comfortable, and the pillow solid but soft. A very nice combination. It didn't take long for either alchemist to pass out.